that if you pip install something, you might touch some code that I've written, but PyPI is like 99% cached when you use it, so it's pretty likely that you're not actually using it. All right, cool. Recording?
Yep.
All right, so hey, this is me. I'm Dustin. I'm really excited to be back here at Philly PUG because Philly PUG was actually the place where I kind of like got my start talking. This was like 4 years ago, maybe in this very room actually. I gave like one of my first talks in front of a large audience, and now it's like my job. I go around and give talks and speak at conferences and do a bunch of other stuff too. This talk is not really about like, I work at Google. This talk's not about Google. This talk is about PEP 572. But before I tell you about PEP 572, I have to tell you a little bit about Python governance. Python governance is the answer to the question, how do we govern the language? Like, how do we make changes and decide what is going to happen to the Python language as it evolves? So when Python was first created, its creator installed himself as the benevolent dictator for life, the BDFL. And he could do that because he created the language himself. So dictator meaning that he's just going to do whatever he wants to Python. And benevolent meaning that even though he's going to do whatever he wants, he's generally going to look out for us as Python users, right? Like he's not going to do crazy things that would send people away from the language. So this is the creator of Python. His name is Guido van Rossum. And it's important to know that Guido installed himself as BDFL like 25 years ago when Python was first created. But he doesn't really make all these decisions himself anymore. Like, Python is incredibly complex. And he doesn't like exert his dictatorship over all of it. Instead, we have this process, and it's the Python Enhancement Proposal process, the PEP process. It's kind of like a constitution. So we started with PEP 1, and we sort of just like keep creating PEPs, and they keep changing the language and how things work with the language, and each one builds on the previous PEP, and it's kind of like how like a country is governed. Like the constitution has amendments, we continue making amendments, and repealing amendments, and bringing them back. So that's the PEP. Can anyone name a PEP? I think PEP 8. PEP 8, yeah. PEP 8. I thought you were going to say that. So PEP 8 is the style guide for Python code. Probably maybe the most well-known
PEP 20.
Well, okay, so yeah, that's the author of PEP 8 is Guido van Rossum himself. He wrote this pretty early PEP. It sort of tells us how we should write Python, what it kind of should look like. PEP 20 is also a great PEP. That's the Zen of Python. That's what you get if you type import this in your Python REPL. The author of that is Tim Peters. He's one of the original core contributors to Python. My favorite PEP is PEP 566, Metadata for Python Packages, Software Packages 2.1. The reason I like this PEP is because I am the author of this PEP. So when I wrote this PEP, there were kind of 3 stages of the process for creating a new PEP. So the first was draft. I came up with a draft of this PEP in a sort of format that all the PEPs fall into. It had an introduction, an outline, all these things, but also sort of had some metadata and all this other stuff. Then the PEP was accepted, or it could have been rejected, but it was accepted. And then the PEP was implemented. So we sort of like have this draft process where people review the PEP, nothing's been decided yet, it goes up for acceptance or rejection, and then it gets implemented. So important to note that Guido himself did not approve my PEP. And I'm actually pretty sure that Guido has no idea who I am. He's never even read my PEP, like he doesn't care. Because Guido doesn't really like he focuses on core Python stuff, and my PEP was about Python packaging stuff. So what has happened in the sort of intervening years is that Guido has entrusted people called BDFL delegates to make decisions about the language on his behalf. So these are either in areas that like Guido doesn't know as well as someone else, he doesn't care, or he just thinks that someone else is going to be a better steward of like that corner of the language, or that corner of our process, or whatever we do with the language. So it kind of looks like this. There's Guido, and there's delegates, and the delegates are then approve the PEPs, and sometimes Guido is also approving PEPs himself as well. But that's happening less and less. Yeah?
At what point do the PEPs get their number? Only once they're accepted, or when they're...
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, when do PEPs get their number? So they get their number sort of when they have been drafted and decided that they are going to be up for consideration. So sometimes the numbers are pre-reserved, and I'll talk a little bit about that later too. And sometimes the numbers are just sequential. So like the number for my PEP was just totally random, basically. There are PEPs like PEP 404. You should go see what that is. It's kind of so let's talk about PEP 572, just a random number. This PEP was called assignment expressions, and you might have heard about this PEP before because it caused a little bit of drama. And it's all about these two operators, these two characters. And this is a new operator in Python, and it has a name, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. Instead, I'm going to call it the Walrus operator because it kind of looks like a walrus laying on his side. I gave this talk once before, and someone was really concerned that this walrus was dead. He is not dead. He is just resting. He's actually not dead. All right, so I'm gonna instead of like reading the PEP to you, I'm gonna give you some examples of how this new operator can be used in Python. And I'm not gonna like have any opinions about this. I'm just gonna show you like what it does and what the goal of it might be. So one thing you might do with it is balancing lines of code and big O complexity, right? So here's an example. This is I'm initializing a new list in Python to the foo variable, and it has 3 elements, and they are f of x to the power 2, and f of x to the power 3. That's fine. Totally valid list, totally valid Python. Let's say that in this case that f of x is a really expensive function. And it's not like memoized or cached or anything like that. So every time I call f of x, it's going to take, like, let's say a minute. So creating this list is going to take 3 minutes. However, let's say f of x also doesn't have any side effects, so every time I call it, I'm going to get the same result from it when I pass it the same variable. So normally what I would say to do, like as Python developers, you're going to take that out and you're going to put it into a separate variable. You're going to call it once, store it in a variable, and then you do whatever you need to do in the list, and you avoid that extra complexity of this function call. That's totally fine. With the Walrus operator, you don't need to break it out into 2 lines like this. Inside the creation of the list, you can define a variable that's in scope just for that list, and then you can reuse that as you define the list. So here, I'm setting the variable y to the value of f of x, just like I had it on the other line, and then I can reuse that later in that list as I'm creating it. So I can reuse this value that's kind of expensive to compute if I need to. That looks kind of weird, right? Another thing you can do is avoid potentially inefficient comprehensions. So here's an example, and this is just a totally regular Python example. I'm initializing empty list results. I'm iterating over some data, doesn't matter what it is. For each thing in that, each object in that thing that I'm iterating over, I'm going to run the function f of x on it. If it's truthy, I'll add it to the list, and if it's not, I don't add it. So eventually I'm just sort of like, I'm kind of like filtering the list or doing something like that. And one thing to note is, generally, if you see this pattern where you're initializing an empty list and then hitting a for loop, that's kind of a code smell, because Python has a really nice feature called list comprehensions, and you could take this and turn it into a list comprehension that looks just like this, and it would behave exactly the same. Except, it would be twice as inefficient, because again, if f of x is a really expensive function here, we went from calling it once, as we iterated over, to now we're doing it twice to check the result of f of x in our conditional. So that's not great, and it's less efficient. So we could go back to what we had before, which is a little bit less readable, or we could use the Walrus operator, and it would look like this. So similarly to defining the variable y that I did in the previous list, I can do it here too. In that conditional, I can set y equals f of x, and then I can use that later in the list comprehension. And one important thing to note here is when you write list comprehensions, they actually kind of go from the bottom up. So the y is defined down below, and then you can reuse it up above. It's not intuitive. Another thing you might use the Walrus operator for is if you have unnecessary variables in scope. So let's look at this example. This is a pretty common pattern if you do stuff with regular expressions. You're going to search a pattern for a regular expression, and you get a match object. And sometimes that match object is truthy, and sometimes it's not, and we don't want to do anything with it. It's like none or something. So we have to test it, right? And so you do something like this. You run the regular expression, and you see what match you get from it, and then if it's a valid match, you can do things with it. If it's not, you just continue to do whatever. Yeah. With the Walrus operator, we can condense this into 2 lines. So in that if statement, match is defined just in the scope of that if statement, and it doesn't exist outside of the if statement at all. So later in the code, I can, if I wanted to, I could use match again. It wouldn't be polluted from the previous scope. And yeah, then I don't have to think about it sort of living outside that if statement. It's more contained in it. One more example. Processing streams and chunks. This is another pretty common pattern in Python. Let's say I want to read a file, and I want to read like whatever this number is, not that many bytes from it at a time. I want to do them in chunks, over and over. So I'll read the first chunk, and then I'll iterate. While that chunk doesn't come back as empty, I'll just keep processing. I'll keep calling over and over again, process chunk, process chunk, process chunk. Eventually chunk will become like none or empty or something like that, and the while loop will exit and then we'll be done. The thing that's not great about this pattern is we have the same thing happening on 2 lines, so it's a little bit redundant. We had that magic variable, 8192, whatever that is, also defined on 2 lines, and we could fix that, we could turn it into a variable, put it outside, but still, we're doing the same thing on 2 lines. It seems like kind of redundant, right? With the walrus operator, you could do this. File chunk, walrus, file.read, whatever, and it works. It is exactly the same. And chunk only exists in the scope of that while loop. So we took 2 lines, took 4 lines, turned it into 2 lines. We made it a little readable, a little more readable. Cool. All right, you might say, why? All those examples before were totally fine, with the exception of the ones that were supposedly inefficient. You could also get around that inefficiency by writing an extra line of code, pulling a variable out of the list, whatever. So why would you want to do this? Well, one argument that people might have is that fewer lines are kind of better, right? Like we write a lot of lines of code, we have to review lots of lines of code. If you can minimize your diff by just a little bit, your programmer friends will generally appreciate that, right? Like the less code you write, usually the better. We don't measure our value as programmers by how many lines of code we write. So maybe this is a good thing. Like it'll help us minimize the number of lines of code we write. Yeah, so in this example, like I could turn it into this. 50% reduction code. My coworkers are going to be totally stoked about that. But actually, maybe the more important thing is that fewer lines could be more efficient, right? So when this PEP was proposed, people went and found examples in actual code, like in open source projects, their own code bases, whatever, of people doing the inefficient things that I showed before because they were trying to be efficient. So here's an example. This is efficient. But instead of writing this, someone wrote this because they wanted it to all be on one line. And like, that's not even that readable to me. But, okay, it's on one line, but it's actually calling match, read.match twice here. And so it's running that regular expression twice. So it's twice as slow to figure out this group. With the Walrus operator, they could have done this. It's honestly not that much more readable, but it's more efficient, and it's still on one line. So if they had that available to them, maybe they would have done that instead. And so ultimately, it's like this trade-off between like developer time and computer efficiency that the Walrus operator helps us adjust a little bit. Another thing that you might be thinking, looking at this operator, is that it kind of looks like the equals operator, right? We have the equals operator in Python to assign variables. The thing to note here is that the Walrus operator is actually nothing like the equals operator. And in fact, everywhere that you can use the equals operator, you cannot use the Walrus operator for various reasons. So one example, with the equals operator, we can do this like multiple targets thing where you set x equals y equals z equals 0, and they all get initialized to 0. You can't do that with the Walrus operator. Can't happen. Another one is assignments to things other than a variable name. So here I can set the ith index of a to x. That's fine. Can't do that with the Walrus operator. Another one is assignments to things other. That's the same comment, but this is a slightly different thing. I'm setting the property here to a list. You can't do that with the Walrus operator because it's not a variable. Another one is comma priority. So here, when you say x equals 1, 2, you get a tuple. You don't get that if you do the Walrus operator. You get x equals 1, and then 2 is just like hanging out over there. And the last one is augmented assignment. This is the plus equals thing. So you can do plus equals tax, but you can't do plus colon equals tax. In fact, like, I don't even know what we would call that. It's like a walrus with like a pope hat on it. Can't have that. All right, so that's PEP 572 in a nutshell. And I see some like slightly confused faces, maybe some people thinking, I'm not sure if I like that, I'm not sure if I would use that, I'm not sure I understand it, I don't know what to call it, because he's calling it the Walrus operator and isn't using the real name. And so yeah, that was generally also the reception of people that first saw this. And people had kind of like a pretty strong gut reaction to it, actually. People kind of, generally don't like change. Programmers especially don't really like change, I've discovered. So when people saw this, they kind of felt like they immediately understood it, and they had this like very visceral reaction to it. So some of their arguments were things like this. Backwards compatibility, right? If we introduce a new feature syntax to the language in some version of Python, it's not going to work in any older version. So any time that I use it, I can only use the latest, greatest version of Python forwards. And so it's not backwards compatible. And that's a valid argument, right? But things like that happen to Python all the time. Python has lots of backwards incompatible changes, breaking changes, that kind of thing. Another argument is teachability. Like, what do we call this? I have not been using a real name for it. I've been calling it the Walrus operator, and actually, like, in the last year since this proposal was first drafted, people have been calling it the Walrus operator too, because the actual name for it, which is the named expression operator, is not very intuitive. Like, if I told you, hey, Python's getting a named expression operator, you would have no idea what that meant, right? Like, what is a named expression? So there's not really a great name for it. Walrus operator sort of just describes what it looks like, but it's jargon, and we shouldn't really use jargon if we can avoid it. So the name, the teachability of it, the sort of confusion about like when you might want to use it, that's a good argument too. The argument was just like, it's ugly. Like, I don't like it. It looks really weird. Like, it's not what Python's supposed to look like. I don't want it. So yeah, these are the arguments. There were mailing list threads about this, like really long mailing list threads about this. There were official polls of the core developers, and actually, this is kind of interesting. Of the core developers, 8% said they liked it, 76% said they disliked it, and 16% said they had no opinion. So that's interesting. Some of the core developers also have some quotes from them. So Tim Peters, he was the guy who authored the Zen of Python. He said that the current proposal would have allowed a modest but clear improvement in quite a few bits of code. So he was one of the people that went and found some of the examples like, yeah, this could make it a little more efficient maybe. Barry Warsaw, also a core developer, he said that since it changes the syntax of the language, people tend to focus on that rather than understanding the deeper semantic issues. So he was sort of like, yeah, people, they look at this, it's 2 characters, they feel like they understand it, and that's what they're focused on. Łukasz Langa, he said, dictators should dictate. He said, Guido should just do whatever he wants and ignore what everyone is saying, because he is a dictator. And Guido actually said he had to stop reading the threads so he wouldn't go insane. Wow. So this is what happened. Guido stopped reading the threads, and then one day, he went to the Python PEP repository, and he marked the PEP as accepted. Went from draft to accepted, and then he sent this email, transfer of power. He said, now that PEP 572 is done, I don't want to ever have to fight so hard for a PEP to find that so many people despise my decisions. I would like to remove myself entirely from the decision process. I'll still be there. He went on a permanent vacation, that's what he called it. This is not great, and I'll tell you why in a second. So this is the reaction to people when they found out that Guido was stepping down. This guy is pretty interesting. Like a while beforehand, he had tweeted this thing, Dear Python, all I want for my birthday is, and that's the chunk example I showed earlier. And then when Guido sat down, he said, I just realized thanks to PEP 572, my birthday wish has been granted, but like, at what cost? Guido, our creator of our language, has stepped down. Hennick said, PEP 572 still rocks. What a farewell gift. This person says, that feel when Reddit says PEP 572 has lost the Zen of Python, but the author is the author of the Zen is a co-author of the PEP. So Tim Peters actually was one of the co-authors of this PEP. So that doesn't make any sense. This person said that they are shocked by the vitriol we throw at people who run important FOSS projects. And Guido just couldn't handle what people were saying and how rude and abrasive they were being about this feature. This person, for example, said PEP 572 is a trash feature, and I'm sad that it was the straw that broke Guido's back. All right, I want to be really clear here if we're talking about straws. The straw that broke Guido's back was not trash PEPs heaped onto him by PEP authors. It was people calling his work trash by random strange people on the internet, right? Like, Guido is a human that has thoughts and feelings just like us, right? Like, people sort of look at him as like a celebrity and they think they can say whatever they want about the work that he does. But like, he's just a person, right? Dictators are people too. And like, we can extend this. I've seen so many open source maintainers suffering from burnout and getting the same kind of feedback from people online. They're really like, maintainers are people too. Like, when you remember that, really just people are people too, right? When you're interacting with someone on the internet, just like, be a good person, because it's another person on the other end of the line. Yeah. So I'm going to preempt some questions about this, and then we'll also do Q&A at the end. So one question is, what does this mean for Python? I gave this talk before. Someone in the audience was like, is this going to be the PEP to end all PEPs? Like, are we never going to be able to change Python ever again? And that was actually kind of true. So like I said before, the power comes from Guido. So with him stepping down, the BDFL delegates couldn't approve PEPs, and therefore we couldn't actually make any changes to Python at all. I mean, someone could have like gone wild and made a change and I guess maybe assumed the dictatorship position, but that didn't happen. So we were kind of stuck for a second. However, it's going to be okay. So what happened was immediately after this happened, a bunch of smart people, mostly core developers, got together and they started working on solving this governance problem. Basically figuring out what are we going to do post-Guido. They created PEP 8000, so the question before about like PEP numbers, they're kind of also reserved in blocks, kind of like IP addresses or whatever. So the 8000 block is reserved for all the governance issues and problems and things like that. So they created PEP 8000, which is an overview of the governance language and what we're going to do about the problem. They also created PEP 8001, which determined how we were going to make this decision, how we were going to vote on it, who was going to be able to do it, an explicit list of like every single voter, and it was eventually just the core contributors who were going to vote on this. They did PEP 8002, which is a survey of other open source projects that also have governance models, seeing which ones work, which ones didn't work, which ones have changed, what we could learn from all these other communities. And then they created a whole range of proposals. So everything from PEP 8010 to 8016, there were 6 proposals, all these different like wide array of possible governance models for language. And this kind of range everything from like direct democracy, where people are voting, like all of you could vote on every single PEP that came out, to like we just have a dictator again and we just appoint someone else, to like stuff that's in between. There's one that was like also total anarchy, where people can just do whatever they want. Did not get excited. So there was a vote, it was in December of last year, and we chose a governance model. And the governance model was the PEP 8016, the steering council model, and this was proposed by Nathaniel Smith and Donald Stuft. And then once we had chosen a model, we had to figure out who was going to be on this steering council. The steering council called for a team of 5 Python developers that were appointed to this council for an indeterminate amount of time. And it actually comes to an interesting thing. It said, that's all we're going to do. The steering council, after that point, has the permission and the ability to make whatever decisions they want. So all we're going to do is sort of bootstrap the process. We're going to give 5 people this title, and then they can go ahead and just make whatever change. They tried to actually like define as little as possible, and just basically just give us a basic framework for making more decisions. So I think that's why it was actually accepted, because it didn't try to do too much. And so there was a vote in January of this year, and a bunch of people ran for the steering council, and all the core developers voted on it. And then we elected the steering council. So this was, the steering council spoke, they did a panel at PyCon this year. This is all of them. So that's on the left of Barry Warsaw, Brett Cannon, Carol Willing, Guido Van Rossum, and Nick Coughlin. So all these people were core developers. Guido himself ran for the steering council and was elected to it, as you might not be surprised to hear. And they are going forward, they've already started the process of the backlog of PEPs that have been created since Guido stepped down, making some decisions about them. They work as a collective and sort of work together to move Python forward. And so we're sort of back into the same process with a slightly different governance model, where we can now make changes to language and continue doing things. More Q&A. So, will the Walrus operator become part of Python? So it actually already has in Python 3.8. So Emily Morehouse, she's a core developer. She implemented this. It's actually the first thing that she implemented in the language, which is really impressive. And yeah, it's in the language. So Python 3.8 is in alpha right now. You could download it and install it from python.org. If you don't want to, it's in alpha. Like, don't replace your system Python with 3.8. But if you want to play with the Walrus operator, you could do it. You could also like run a Docker container with 3.8. You could probably do that. So yeah, it's in the language. You might say, I don't like it. Like, what am I supposed to do? Well, if you don't like it, my advice to you is don't write it, right? No one's going to force you to use the Walrus operator, except maybe your team. But if your team wants to use it, maybe it's your job to convince them not to, or just have that discussion with your team and do it in a reasonable way. Another question, is Guido coming back? So this kind of depends on what you mean. Maybe is Guido coming back to Python? And obviously, yes, he's on the steering council now. Yes. He's on the steering council. He's still involved. He's just not the person that's going to have the final say in everything, right? So his opinion is going to be equal to that of everyone else in the steering council. And yeah, is he coming back as BDFL? Like, no. We have the steering council. It's working great. Python is like 27 years old at this point. It's kind of like Guido's child, and it needs to like get out of the house and survive on its own without it. So I think he is happy. Everyone is happy that, you know, that we've solved this problem, and Guido is still on board and helping guide the steering council and all that stuff. Another question you might have, is this going to happen again? And again, that kind of depends on what you mean. So maybe your question is, will another PEP ever be this controversial? And I would say, this is my guess, probably not. This PEP was maybe an outlier. It was a very small syntax change that was easily understandable by a lot of people, and they had a really visceral reaction, like I said before. But maybe what you actually mean is, will people continue to be negative on the internet?
No.
I don't know. I kind of hope not. I hope that, especially us in the Python community, can learn from this a little bit, take a step back, and sort of think about when we're interacting with people, when we're trying to make decisions and make changes to the language, just interact with open source maintainers, issues, file bugs, all those things that we sort of recognize that there's another person on the end and we treat them with the respect that we would want ourselves. But maybe not. Python is a really widely used and adopted language. For a lot of people, the language feels totally perfect the way it is. So maybe this is the status quo. Maybe every time we try to make a change from now on, it's going to be a huge deal. I hope it's not. I hope Python can continue to evolve, but I guess we'll see, right? So that's it. Thanks, everyone. Any questions? Yeah.
Okay, not to dig up worms or bodies. I only learned about 572 today, and went and scrolled through the PEP and saw that as was among the rejected possibilities, which, having been of the generation that started with Pascal, I only know the Walrus operator does something else.
Yeah.
I was curious why as didn't get chosen, since we already have temp variables using as in other contexts.
Yeah. So I'll repeat the question. The question is, instead of the walrus operator, the colon equals, why didn't we use the keyword as? So file as chunk, whatever, from the example 4. And yeah, you're also saying that the walrus operator actually exists in other languages, and in some other languages it does something completely different. Some languages it's actually assignment, some languages it does other things. I'm not going to get into it, but so yeah, the walrus operator has kind of been borrowed a little bit, and yeah, it's a great question, and actually I agree. I think as kind of makes sense. It's a little bit easier to talk about and use. The problem with as is that it's already a reserved keyword in Python. So you can import something as whatever and rename some important module. So because of that alone, is reserved.
But it's already has so many context overloads. There's import as, there's with as.
Yeah.
Or, it seems like a great way to just expand the available behavior with as.
So I think on the surface it looks that way. I'm not a core developer, so I can't really speak to Python internals that much. But and you can read this in the PEP. In the PEP, they talk about as and why it was not chosen as the as the operator. And most of it is just because it already has the semantic meaning in Python. So yeah, I'd recommend go and read it. And there's a lot of discussion about that specifically as well. Yeah. Yes.
So you're involved in packaging, and I guess that happens for many users to be the most frustrating aspect of using Python. So I'm guessing, you must get involved in heated discussions, or maybe you're not heated, but people are against you. And how have you personally dealt with that, and is it a drain?
Yeah, that's a really great question, actually. Yeah, so Tim kind of mentioned, but one of the things I work on in the Python community, I maintain the Python package index. I've also contributed to PIP, Twine, set of tools, a lot of these other packaging tooling, and I've written a PEP about changing metadata and stuff for Python packages. So you were absolutely right. The question was Python packaging is really painful, and people can get kind of vitriolic about it as well. And that's definitely true. It's definitely a corner of Python where there's a lot of potential for that kind of disagreement. I think it's two things have happened. One, people have gotten so used to how bad it is that they've stopped caring whatsoever. But the other thing is, I actually think a lot of the people and maintainers that work on packaging stuff are extremely level-headed. So the two people that proposed PEP 8016, the steering council model, they are both Python packaging people. People that work, like Nathaniel defined the wheel specification. Donald is one of the original contributors to PEP and also one of the original contributors to PyPI. And so they come from like the packaging realm. I think they just have really thick skin because of that probably. So they kind of knew what to do and how to set up the steering council for success. But yeah, I mean, personally, I think I haven't experienced a whole lot of that. Like I've experienced more open source maintainer burnout more than anything else. I haven't had people really being nasty to me specifically online. I kind of just write PEPs about metadata and stay in the shadows a little bit. But yeah, I think a lot of people have experienced similar stuff, and maybe just not on the same scale. Like Guido is super famous in our community, and I'm not super famous, so there's a big discrepancy there. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
So where do you lie on the clarity versus brevity spectrum, and are there any new features or syntax changes you want to see in Python?
Oh, good question. The things, okay, so the question was, where do I fall on that spectrum? And I'm gonna like defer and not answer that question, because I don't know if you noticed, I gave this whole talk and didn't really state my opinion. My opinion doesn't matter here. Like, you need to make your own decision about these kind of things, decide if you want to use a new feature, decide how you feel about it. I'm not here to tell you if it was the right choice for the language or not. I think it's a good hint that it was accepted and the creator thought it was a good idea. I think Guido has done a really good job. I mean, just judging by the success of Python, he's done a good job making good decisions for the language. He hasn't really made a lot of mistakes. So, and not just the language, but also the community. Guido has been, in terms of a leader of an open source community, far better than a lot of the other open source leaders and maintainers. I think like the only other ones I can really think of that are on par with Guido are like Larry Wall, or these guys that just have done a great job leading their communities. The second part of your question was, what do I want to see changed in Python? I'm not really that into new syntax and stuff. Like, it's fine if it gets added, I'll use it probably. I want to see, this Python standard library is a mess right now. And actually, if you're interested in learning more about that, at PyCon there was a language maintainer summit, and one of the talks, Amber Brown gave a talk about Python, batteries included, but the batteries are leaking. Meaning that Python has this like kind of problem with the standard library where there's a really popular third-party package that's up on PyPI, and the core developers, they want to use it. So this happened with like the adders project, since now we have data classes, and it's like not quite the same thing, but we've like copied and pasted it in the standard library. And so like that is not great. I'd like to see that process improve there. There's a lot of really old standard library modules that don't really need to be there anymore and kind of slow down Python what the core developers have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, I don't know. I think most of my opinions are about like what does and doesn't come with Python in terms of like libraries and modules, but I don't have any like feature requests. I think Python's pretty swell. I don't know.
Funny you mentioned that. Christian Himes just put together the PEP for removal of all these packages today and asked for a review for it on Twitter. I literally read it, and some of the packages, some of the features from core Python that they're talking about removing are absolutely hilarious, including removal of the Sun AU audio format and a lot of support for the Mac OS 9 operating system. And certain bindings for interacting with Commodore operating systems. These are still in the Python that you download.
Yeah.
So there is some cleanup to be done.
Yeah, and they sound super old and rusty, but they actually create a maintenance burden for the core developers too. It's like, I don't know, like at some point we can't support everything forever. And at one point they were super important, but now they are not as important. Yeah, as kind of referencing Christian's proposal to do that, to deprecate a bunch of them. False.
Yeah.
As a pro programmer, like, what's a little more syntax? The people who obviously, like, anytime you want to change syntax, people get,
Yeah. I mean, but
strong opinions about it. It seems to me though that like the problem is trying to solve is like it's sort of a roundabout way of creating lexically scoped variables, which Perl has and C has, and they're super useful. And Python doesn't really have them, except now you do with these golden things. And I think probably a meaner way of doing lexically scoped variables might have been something better. So
what's your question? No, I'm just kidding.
I think that's sort of my comment. Like I wish like there was something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if it had existed in Python since day one, no one would have batted an eye at it, right? But it hasn't, and we added it later. So yeah,
I kind of think you have to see code to see where the problems are.
Yeah, it is interesting to, so you mentioned at the beginning, like in Perl, like what's the new syntax? Like Perl has so much syntax and you can do so much with it. Yeah, there's like a huge difference in the community here where like Python users get really reactive to small syntax changes. And some communities are like, yeah, do whatever you want, you know, and that's fine. Like both are totally fine and valid ways to do a programming language. So just don't be mean on the internet. Yeah.
You may have mentioned this, but is in the PEP that created the governing body, was there any kind of time limit or like I don't know?
Yeah, I was about to say that the answer to that question in this talk, and then I couldn't actually remember what it was.
Okay.
I am not sure. You should read the PEP. It says it in it.
So Ken writes the developer of Python requests and a bunch of other packages has said that the standard library is where ideas go to die. Is he going to be involved in some of the culling?
I don't believe so. I can't speak for him. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that sentiment. Like there are a lot of really useful stuff in the standard library. Like it's just
But once they're there, they can't evolve
Right.
further.
and that's the thing. Like there's a certain level of like dependence that you can have on a package on PyPI, and then if that's in the standard library, a lot more people are going to depend on it working in a very specific way. So it's harder to change it, go back and fix mistakes, that kind of thing. Thanks.
This is more of a comment, but I'll make it a question on Jeopardy.
Thank you.
Did anyone ever suggest that maybe they should add begin end to Python?
Begin end?
Instead of indentation for loops and conditionals? And is that person still alive?
Oh, I don't know how to answer that question. If you want it, you should make a PEP, but I have a feeling about what the result
Like
is.
you said, you couldn't envision something causing so much controversy.
Are you trying to set a record?
I referenced PEP 404 before. It's a joke PEP. There are some joke PEPs. Like I think it would be interpreted as a joke PEP, probably if you were to create
If anyone's interested,
import braces.
if anyone's interested in reading up on the packages being removed, it's just been assigned a number like an hour ago, so it's PEP 594. So
Yeah.
witness it in action.
Oh, so I should say
Didn't have a number earlier today.
one advantage to the steering council is that things are moving a little bit faster now. Like Guido was kind of a bit of a bottleneck before, which is fine because like he needed to exert his decision-making process over the process. And now it moves a little bit quicker, and so yeah, there's like kind of been this like Cambrian explosion of PEPs now that the steering council exists. And I think it's
From writing to Twitter review to on the site with a
Yeah.
number.
well. So the thing to mention is like usually before you see the draft of the PEP, it's getting passed around like in the back channel. So a lot of I already saw that PEP before it was posted on Twitter. So
I heard that PyPA was created as a joke. Is that true? And is it, do you know about that? And when did it
Yeah.
not become a joke if it still isn't a joke?
sure. So the question was, I heard that PyPA was created. PyPA is the Python Packaging Authority. It wasn't created as a joke. So the organization was created just to sort of like group together all the packaging tools into some cohesive unit that might work together. The name was kind of a joke.
Right.
So like the Packaging Authority has no authority over anything. The only authority that we actually, and so I, as like contributor to these things, I'm technically in the authority, whatever that means. The only authority that they have is to enact a code of conduct on all the projects under the umbrella and make sure, and also like the goal is kind of make sure that if like someone steps away from PIP, like it has no maintainers, other people from other projects are going to come in and say, well, this is a PyPA project and we need to keep it going, so they'll add support for it. So yeah, like kind of true, not exactly true. Any other questions? Question about Python packaging, PyPI?
And I was gonna see if it was in the PEP, but you know, I know in the Django community at some point people were talking about all the batteries that were included in there and potentially ripping those out and including them as additional packages that could be downloaded separately, which is something that can happen today because everyone has a consistent connection, kinda. But do you know, or do you have any opinions on that kind of potential eventuality instead of the Python standard library?
Yeah. So the question is like, in Django community, they were talking about taking parts of what is core Django out and into like separate modules or whatever, and will that happen to Python maybe? Sorry, I just want my screen to go to sleep. That already happens. So like if a new standard library module is introduced in like Python 3.7, a lot of times if it's particularly useful, it gets backported, especially if it wasn't copying some previously existing thing. It gets backported to older versions of Python as a PyPI module. So you can, a lot of them you can actually install in older versions and continue to use them. The thing that's important to note about standard library modules is the reason that a lot of times a third-party library will be brought in to the core Python library is because the core developers want to use it, but they can't use any package from PyPI in core Python, right? There's no way to like install something before you have to bundle it with Python basically when you distribute it. So like adders and data classes was an example of that. They really wanted essentially the functionality that the adders project. And if you guys don't know about adders and data classes, there's like a million talks about data classes. They really like reduce boilerplate. It's quite nice. They wanted to be able to do that in the core library, but they couldn't use the adders project, so they basically had to re-implement it, or they had to make adders a first-class like standard library module, and that didn't happen for various reasons. So they just copied it basically, and that's sort of what the comment where like that's where things go to die is because that project, like now both those, there are two versions of that project, and like less people use adders than they did before, and less people use data classes than if adders didn't exist, and it's like, it's weird. It's like this parallel universe of packages. So, yeah, that's a great question. Any other questions? Yeah.
So how long before there's a PEP for removing the Walrus operator? People are discussing that.
So that's a good question. I want to say that doesn't really happen. Like once a decision has been made, people aren't going to try and get controversial and try and reverse it. I don't know. I mean, a lot of people disagreed with that and don't want it to exist, but they're not going to, like, it's just going to stir up drama. Like, it's not actually going to happen. At this point, like, the decision has been made. Occasionally, things get removed, like the example of removing standard library modules. I don't think there's ever a PEP to introduce those. But it's more about, like, hey, this is our process for deprecating things in a standard library, and we need to fix it a little bit because it's not quite working. And less about, like, well, we made a decision 10 years ago, and that was a bad decision, so now we're going to fix it. Usually, it's more like moving forward and not taking a step backwards.
So what happens to the modules once they're in the standard library? Are they still maintained by the people who wrote them originally?
It depends on the module. So like virtualenv is a good example. So folks kind of maybe don't know, but like virtualenv that I think maybe a lot of people have used was a third-party package. And then it was like super useful, and it actually made a lot of sense to ship it with Python. So there's the venv module in standard library now. And what kind of happened was, I mean, it's not like something that needs really continually worked on. So the core developers maintain it, and then the people that maintain virtualenv have kind of just stepped away. So like, well, why would you use the virtualenv project if it's in the standard library, unless you're like on 2.7 and we don't care about 2.7 anymore. So like sometimes it kind of depends on who authored it, who the maintainers were.
Like in Perl, there's a whole bunch of packages that come with Perl, but they're still maintained by the people that wrote them. And so it's part of the job of people maintaining Perl is when they put a new version that hasn't broken all those modules.
It's one of the problems, I think.
One of the reasons why you want to kind of cull it occasionally, because
I think is one of the kind of problems that Python has, is that in order to contribute to a package in the standard library, you have to be a core Python developer. And like that's a hard bar. Like I'm not a core Python developer. I'm nowhere close to being one. I probably won't be one. I could maintain those packages, but I'm like actually not allowed to because I don't have, like I could submit pull requests and stuff, but like I'm not a core developer. I'm not going to be making decisions about it. So I think it's actually kind of a problem, and that's something maybe Perl got right. Yeah. That might change. Who knows? So there's a lot of talk also about, like Rust does a really nice thing where they bundle a lot of stuff up with Rust, but those are still separate. Like Cargo is a separate tool, separate package. And I think Python's starting to like learn a little bit from that too.
Yeah, so do you think that with Python 2, or maybe going away soon, we'll see a lot of acceleration and like the development speed of a lot of third-party packages? who now can focus efforts more? Or
Oh, you sweet summer child. Python 2 is not going away anytime soon. So for those that don't know, like Python 2 will be at end of life, January 1st, 2020. That's when it will stop being supported by the core developers. So you won't be able, well, maybe you'll still be able to download it from python.org. You have to be determined. But no one's going to be fixing, like if there was on January 2nd, a like huge severity vulnerability in Python 2.7, it's just not going to get fixed. Like no one's going to work on it. No one wants to work on it. It was EOL for Python 2 was like extended by 5 years. So it was actually supposed to be 5 years ago. So it's really past, it's expired at this point. So the answer to your question, if like things will speed up now that that's happened, is no. Like a lot of packages are dropping support for Python 2, and a lot of big ones have dropped support for Python 2 as well. But the thing is, those old versions of those packages that still support Python 2 still exist, and so people are going to just continue to use those to a certain extent. So like some maintainers are going to be able to be freed, and they can, it's their decision. They can say, I'm not going to support Python 2 anymore. Like, hooray, time to write a lot of Python 3 features. But I think it's mostly like a small maintenance burden. That's maybe, yeah, I don't know. For me, like I'm going to drop, I have like a couple little packages. I'm just going to drop Python 2 support whenever it causes a problem. Like if it's, I do something and it's breaking, or I want to use the Walrus operator, I don't know. I won't use that probably, but just for backwards compatibility's sake. Yeah, I might drop it someday, you know. But it's kind of like per project, that kind of thing. And yeah, these are great questions, by the way. It's awesome. Yeah.
You said if there was a problem on like a CD on January 2nd, it wouldn't get fixed, but isn't it the distros, the Red Hats?
Oh yeah, that's a great point. Who knows?
The people
Yeah. So the question is like, all right, like if Python 2.7 has a security vulnerability on January 2nd, 2020, core developers aren't going to fix it, but like maybe all of the redistributors of Python, like Red Hat and Canonical specifically, maybe they will fix it. Maybe they will. Who knows? Yeah, it's kind of like a little bit up in the air what's going to happen there, because a lot of people have long-term support contracts with companies to run Python 2.7 and have it available in their distros. And like Red Hat specifically, Red Hat's business model is basically, let's take some really old open source code and keep it running way too long. So if they don't step up and do it, I'm going to be really, really surprised. Yeah, that seems pretty likely that's what's going to happen. So, but it won't be the core developers. They are like adamant that they are not touching it anymore.
This isn't quite related to your topic, but like, one of the frustrating, if someone who uses code written in Python is this very reason that once it changes, everything breaks and you can't use it. I mean, I've never seen any other language except for Python where it's just so hard. Once you get it set up, you want to just keep them with containers. It might be okay.
Yeah. I kind of sense that you're actually talking about packaging stuff, but are you talking about like the language changing?
No,
or?
I'm not even, the language change, fine, do what you want in future versions. I want my 2.7 and I don't want like anything happening to it. That's kind of, because I've got things that run and they're running.
Yeah, you are the prototypical Python 2.7 user. Like, and like, do not like demonize or whatever. This is a totally valid user of Python that wants to continue to do Python 2.7. There are a lot of people that have massive Python 2.7 code bases or Python 2.6 and 2.5 code bases that they have like valid business needs to continue running Python 2, and that's fine. They should be thinking about migrating eventually. Like there are a lot of really great features in Python 3 that they are missing out on, and it's only going to get harder in the future. Like you're gonna.
Well, the containers, you could just put it there and and then just spin it up, run it, and close it.
So you should have came to my talk earlier today that I gave at Wharton. So just like a quick plug, I work at Google for Google Cloud, and we have a really cool product called Cloud Run. I have stickers for it up here, and I'll show it to anyone afterwards if they're interested in seeing it. But basically, it's containers as a service. So you can like take a container, deploy it, it's totally serverless, whatever. When I saw that, I was like, what could I do with this? And I got Python 1.3 to compile on Ubuntu, and I created a Docker image and created the very first Python 1.3 serverless runtime and deployed it to Cloud Run, and like had a functioning web app that was running Python, which is, by the way, 25 years old, so ancient. Amazing that it even compiled on Ubuntu with like minimal patching. So yeah, I mean, That's fine. That's a totally valid, like, take it, put it in a container, and it will run forever, essentially, right? Until, like, containers are now obsolete. And you put that in something else that hasn't been invented yet, so. Yeah. Turtles all the way down, I guess. Cool. Any more questions? All right, so I'll be around hanging out afterwards, yelling about packaging stuff if you want. See what we can fix.